Do you believe in time travel?
Alright, so we're back. We're talking about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we are discussing time travel. This was more of a common idea, or I guess maybe theory, in the earlier days of Remake. It seems like nobody really talked about this anymore, kind of written this idea or concept off. But I don't know how much we've ever really discussed or talked about it, so I've finally wanted to do a video discussing it myself. Now, recently I did tweet about this, which I often do. If you don't follow me on Twitter, I'm talking about FF7 quite a bit on there, kind of almost exclusively, talking about different ideas, concept theories, whatever the case. But I'd seen some people talking about, when it comes to Remake, like the idea of there being some level of time travel within the story is more or less impossible, I guess, in their minds, or the possibility of like Remake being a sequel to the compilation, stuff like that. Like, these are impossibilities, which is a word I do not like when it comes to discussing this game. Usually when it comes to any sort of theory out there for Remake, there's usually a good chunk of evidence, sometimes a mountain of evidence that supports it, which is why there's people that believe in those theories. And that's why there's multiple theories out there that people believe. There's a group that believes this, that, or the other, because there's usually a bunch of evidence to support it. So that's why nothing's kind of currently off the table until we get Rebirth, until we get confirmation of what exactly is happening with this game and the story. You can't really count any one thing out. Now, when I did tweet about this, I had quite a bit of people reply, more than I was expecting, and I think almost every single person disagreed with me, which is perfectly fine. I'm not trying to convince you that time travel is happening with Remake. It's just a concept that may or may not be happening, and you don't have to agree with me. You can absolutely disagree with me if you want to. But I want to say like half of the people that replied kind of gave a little bit of reasons for why they don't think that that's happening, but also it kind of boiled down to, I don't like that, so that's not what's happening with Remake, which is not how this shit works, right? We're not having a conversation about what we do or don't like. We're talking about what may or may not be happening with the story. Again, it's very similar to what we talked about the last video with Genesis being in like the future bits of the Remake story. Like, some people like don't think he's going to be there, but it's not because it wouldn't make sense or whatever the case. It's more so like, I don't like Genesis, so I don't want him in the story. And that's just like, that's not what we're fucking talking about. Doesn't matter what you like. Without even really getting too in-depth on it, there's already a couple pieces of evidence to support the idea of either time travel or Remake being some sort of a sequel. And the idea of a sequel could go a couple different ways, but one of the common ideas is that maybe the FF7 story is on a loop. So when we're playing Remake and we're playing through the FF7 story, this isn't necessarily the first time that's happened. This could be why our group is getting visions of what would be like the future, but technically it could be in the past. These could actually be memories from another time that the story happened, essentially. So what that would mean is that this isn't necessarily like a direct sequel, as in like this is the story that's happening directly after Dirge of Cerberus, but more so it's like the story's replaying again, and maybe Sephiroth is trying to do shit differently this time around to maybe succeed in his plans that he had in the first game. And for all we know when it comes to the Remake story, assuming that this is happening, this could be the second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th time that Sephiroth has tried to succeed in his plans. But regardless, this has happened before, which is why our group is getting the visions that they're getting. You also have the devs referring to Remake as the fifth part of the compilation, which is why some people think that it could be a sequel, but also we're replaying the FF7 story, which doesn't make a lot of sense if it's a part of the compilation, so that kind of leans in favor of the story being on a loop of sorts. Because why the hell are we doing this again if it's a part of the compilation? Now, what we just talked about for the last minute or so isn't necessarily evidence that there's like time travel or the game's a sequel. It's just some of the kind of information that's out there that can kind of lean in favor of that. In terms of like evidence of there being like potentially time travel, we have, for one, at the end of the game, the three whispers that we fight are literally from the future. They're all three described as an entity from a future timeline that is manifested in the present day. And these are obviously meant to be Kadaj, Laws, and Yazoo from Advent Children, but again, they are from the future brought to the present day. From the future brought to the past. So, time travel. That's the end of the video. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now...
Okay, not really, but you kind of get the point there. They are entities brought from the future. They're twisted manifestations of those three characters. They're whisper versions of those characters, but still, you have beings brought from a future timeline to the past. So clearly time travel in some capacity. Maybe this is limited to certain characters. Maybe it's limited to just the Whisper Harbinger for all we know. Or maybe just a planet can do this. Whatever the case, time travel is a possibility. Now, moving beyond this, but we're going to stick with the Whispers for the moment, and we're going to stick around a lot of the Singularity type of area, because that's going to be very important going forward. The Whispers, a common idea is that they work all throughout time. That's something that I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's a common idea or theory out there. That's why you're seeing them during the Zack Final Stand segment, and that's also why us defeating them saves Zack in that moment, because we defeat them all throughout time, so they're not there to make sure Zack dies. But the point is, the Zack Final Stand takes place in the past. It's happening at least 3 months beforehand. That's what it is in the original FF7. I don't know if the remake continuity is exactly the same, but again, in the past. Now, me personally, I don't subscribe to the idea that they're there all throughout time, because That means whenever we defeated them, every single thing about the history of this planet and these characters would change. Because they would never be there at any single moment ever to make sure shit happens like it's supposed to. So just think of all the moments within the remake story that they intervened to kind of keep the FF7 original story happening, right? They would never be there for any of that. Now, you can maybe make the argument that I've heard before that the Whisper Dome around Midgar kind of prevents things from changing that happen within Midgar. Like, everything inside Midgar is unaffected by the changes outside of it, like Zack surviving. And even if that is the case, again, the idea is that they operate all throughout time. So they would have been there in the past to make sure the Nibelheim incident happens. So that could theoretically not have happened, which would then kind of change every aspect of the FF7 story, or maybe even goes as far back as like Professor Gas like discovering and finding Jenova. Like, if they're not there to make sure that happens, maybe Jenova's never found, which again drastically changes the FF7 story. But hell, we're talking about them existing all throughout time, so they maybe were there back in the day whenever the Ancients were fighting Jenova, and maybe they're not there anymore to make sure that the Ancients fucking win, so instead Jenova kills fucking everybody, and then nothing ever happens, and Jenova just takes over the planet and wins. Like, again, the concept of them all existing all throughout time just doesn't add up for me. The point of all this is that I think that the Zack scene's happening in a bottle for a reason. The Whispers went there for a reason, either to make sure that Zack dies, and then they failed, of course, because they're defeated. I've also heard it theorized that they might be trying to help Zack, make sure Zack lives, so that because they're going to be defeated, that he goes on to, like, help save the planet or some shit like that, which is kind of a cool, interesting idea. It'd be a nice spin, because you're expecting them to be there to make sure that he dies, but maybe it's something else. Now, I don't know how much I subscribe to that idea, but it is interesting. But as we talked about previously, we have entities pulled from the future, right? Kadaj and his brothers, for lack of a better term. So if we can have entities pulled from the future to present day, why can't we have people taken from present day to the past? It's the exact same thing. It's time traveling backwards. Or specifically in this case, it'd be the Whisperers going back to Zack's final stand for a specific purpose that we have yet to see what that exactly is. Right now, whether it's the Whisperers themselves doing this, the Whisper Harbinger sending them to the past, the planet sending them to the past, I don't entirely know. And look, I'm not telling you that the Zack scene itself is necessarily happening in a bottle. It could be absolutely that they're being defeated all throughout time, and we're going to see a massive ripple effect as we go forward. But just as of right now, without seeing what that ripple effect is, if there even is one, I just don't think that it's the only moment in the history of the entire goddamn planet the Whispers have been around that has changed, because that just doesn't add up. One thing that also points in the direction of this being a sequel of sorts, or at least happening, post the compilation, is Sephiroth having a wing at the end of the game, because it's something that you didn't see until Advent Children. Now, you could argue that he's always capable of having a wing, he just never did until Advent Children. He kind of technically had one at the end of the original FF7, but he's also a gigantic god monster back then. But you see in Crisis Core characters sprouting wings. Genesis has a black wing, Angel has a white wing. Maybe it's theoretically possible that Sephiroth had one back then, he just didn't have it yet or something. Now, in terms of us being inside the singularity, that one's easy to involve time travel with, because the singularity is the center of a black hole, and it's a place where, place is probably not even the right term, where the gravity is so intense and so dense and so high that nothing can escape it. There's no concept of time. There's not even light. That's why the center of a black hole is black. That's why it's called the black hole. Now, obviously, the majority of this is theoretical, and there will never really be a way to prove it, but it's theorized that you could time travel with black holes. Now, the idea of this has never been about the ability to time travel to any point in time, the past, present, future, whatever the case. It's not exactly how this goes. It's more so that, and Stephen Hawking theorizes that around about the edge of the event horizon, because if you go any further, it'd suck you into the black hole and you'd be gone forever, the time would be moving about half the speed for you. So for you, whenever 8 minutes passes, for us outside of there, it'd be 16 minutes. So whenever you would then leave the event horizon and come out to the regular space or whatever the case, you would technically be traveling into the future, since 16 minutes passed for me, but only 8 minutes passed for you. Hope that all makes sense. That's kind of my brief explanation for an idea of time travel when it comes to black holes and singularities and stuff like that. Another idea, and this is just a theory, is that if you were to go into a black hole, that you might come out on the other side in a different part of the universe. You might be able to travel around through space and shit through black holes. Now, that's obviously just a theory. The more likely scenario is that if you went into a black hole, you'd fucking die, right? That's the actual possibility, the actual probably fact of that. Now, of course, that is purely theoretical, hypothetical, and most likely isn't true, right? Just because, given what a singularity is, a point where there's just gravity so dense that nothing can escape it, light, time, whatever the case. So if you were to even go into a singularity and somehow you could survive that, you'd just probably be stuck there until, I guess, you starve to death or some shit. But of course, we're talking about in reality. This is a video game. So in a fucking video game, a singularity could be a means of time travel for all we know, right? And it's something I've pointed out before on the channel that I feel like not enough people give attention to, is that we go into the singularity, we do all of our shenanigans, and then our group's just magically on the cliff outside of Midgar. We never even see how they got out of there, because it took Sephiroth cutting into a wall of whispers to create a portal to the singularity. But how did we escape there? Is Aerith able to do that or something? Like, I don't know entirely. But who's to say when we came out of the singularity, given that all time and light and gravity and everything's trapped inside a singularity? who's to say that we came out exactly right after where we came in at? As in, this scene right here might not be happening just a brief amount of time after the end of the highway scene before we went into the singularity. For all we know, this is a completely different year. It might not even be the year 0007, right? It could be 5 years in the past, or maybe 5 years in the future, for all we fucking know. Who knows exactly when we came out of the goddamn singularity? That's the thing. Now, to be clear, I'm not telling you that's what's happening, because most likely it's not. Most likely this is just a couple of hours or something after the end of the highway scene, and we're just going to go forward, and there's going to be changes along the way, but it's going to be relatively the same FF7 story. But I'm just saying we could have came out in a different time, and it might not be as drastic as a couple years forward or back. It could be a couple of days forward or back, for all we know. Who knows, right? I'm just saying it's a possibility. That's what we talk about on this channel when we talk about theories, is what's possible. Look, I know we've been on the singularity shit for a while now in the video, but it's pretty important because that's where the end of the game fucking takes place. And we've actually seen singularities and time travels when it comes to the Final Fantasy series before with Final Fantasy VIII. That's actually Ultimecia's goal with time compression. She wants to compress all time and matter and everything into a singularity and then recreate it in whatever her image is she wants. And look, I can't recall every other Final Fantasy game ever, but as far as I'm aware, this is the only other Final Fantasy, off the top of my head anyways, that uses or deals with singularities. And in that case, there is time travel. And actually going back to something I mentioned a minute ago with Sephiroth cutting into the wall of Whisperers, right? He's the reason that we go into the singularity at all. And if he has that power and that capability, and we go with the idea of singularities involving some level of time travel, then who's to say that Sephiroth couldn't just go into the singularity anytime he wants to and come out whenever he wants to? But of course, Sephiroth time traveling creates another rabbit hole that we got to go down, because if he can time travel, then why doesn't he just go back into the past and maybe kill all of our group whenever they're kids so they don't prevent him from succeeding in his plans, right? If they're killed at a very young age, then he can just go forward with what he wants to do in the future and nobody will be there to stop him, realistically. But this is why, in general, when there's a character that has the ability to time travel, it's kind of a plot hole if they don't abuse it, because if there's a bad guy that can travel forward or backwards in time, just go and kill the protagonist of the story, the hero of the story, when they're a kid and they can't defend themselves, because then they're never there in the future to stop you or prevent you from doing anything, right? So that's why, and ultimately that's why time travel itself is a theory, and if you could ever even do it, you can only go into the future to a certain degree, right? You couldn't go into the past. Plus, in general, time traveling into the past creates paradoxes, because even if, say, Sephiroth went back and killed Cloud when he was a kid, right? Then that would mean Cloud was never there in the future. Then a lot of the history of Sephiroth himself would never have happened, etc., etc. The grandfather paradox, you go into the past, kill your grandfather, then you're never technically born. But if you're never technically born, then how did you ever go into the past to kill your grandfather? Again, time travel is just a theory. Something else we see that's in Remake, but also it's actually in the original FF7, is the use of wormholes, which this, in theory, could also involve time travel. Now, the usual concept is that you go through a wormhole, you just end up in a different part of space itself, like a different region. So that's not necessarily itself time travel, but it's theorized, of course, that if you can manipulate it, curve the wormhole a certain way, that you could actually time travel. Now, in Remake's case, Cloud goes through a wormhole and ends up at the edge of creation. And despite the scene's similarities to the ending of FF7 Original, I think it's meant to be entirely different, because I think FF7 Original takes place inside the planet or inside the live stream or something along those lines, but Edge of Creation seems to exist beyond time and space itself. For one, the goddamn name, Edge of Creation, but also whenever Cloud and Sephiroth are talking, they're surrounded by multiple universes, right? The universe of death, the universe of creation. So there seems to be an area or maybe a plane of existence that is outside of the universes themselves. So given that, I would think that there is a level of time travel here too, since you can travel to and fro when it comes to universes. And given that Sephiroth even knows what this is, it seems like he's been here before, so that would also imply the time traveling, him going around trying to do stuff, or having done this before, right? Again, the story being on a loop or a cycle. And kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier with like the group leaving the singularity, there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to Remake. So like this scene happens, Cloud and Sephiroth have their little fight, Sephiroth disappears. But then like, how did Cloud leave this place? How did Cloud leave the edge of fucking creation? Like, where's the explanation on this shit, man? Like, how does that happen? That's why I think that it's possible that there could be something a little bit different in terms of maybe time frames or something like that of us leaving the singularity and or the edge of creation. Because I presume that it was Sephiroth that allowed Cloud to leave the edge of creation, and then maybe in general allowed our group to leave the singularity, but who knows exactly when we're coming out of there. You also have the idea of destiny when it comes to Remake. It's like this fixed thing that you cannot change, that you kind of have to do. The Whisperers will force you to do it, but the fact that they know what the destiny is and what's supposed to happen seems to imply that they can see the future, so who's to say that it can't be traveled to? But also the fact that it has to happen, it's almost like it's happened before. It's like this repeating thing. Again, the cyclical nature of the story when it comes to Remake, potentially. But even if we were to put aside all the quote-unquote evidence that we have, wormholes, singularities, characters from the future, characters in the past, etc., etc., it's also still just a fucking video game. Like, we don't have to go out of our way to prove why time travel is a possibility. because it's a video game. It's magic. It's not real. Like, they can kind of do whatever they want. There doesn't even need to be a tangible scientific reason for how they can time travel. It could just be a piece of material that allows them to do that. And that kind of goes back to something we talked about a little while back with, like, the huge materials that we're seeing whenever Cloud's going through the wormhole to the edge of creation. And the wormhole itself is very different. Obviously, I played the two different scenes in this video. Like, the wormhole that we're seeing in Remake is very different from the one in the original FF7, which is very, very dark, and then at one point it kind of looks like a rocky tunnel. Whereas the one in Remake is very spatial looking, right? But you see huge materia, so it could be implied that the huge materia is being used for this wormhole, or to travel to the edge of creation. So again, materia could be how they time travel. You also have, like, smaller stuff that's a little ambiguous, like the Aerith resolution scene that is described as an Aerith that is closer to memories of the future. Now, you can interpret that a couple different ways. One of them could just simply be an Aerith that kind of knows the events of the future, which we already kind of see in Remake itself anyways, right? We know that characters can kind of know what's going to happen. But it's also described as, like, this Aerith is kind of talking to herself in this moment, kind of giving herself advice, as also with Cloud, of course. But it's also described a lot of times as, like, future Aerith to some people, and it's not literally an Aerith from the future, but you can get where that mindset comes from. So again, not necessarily time travel in the literal sense, but in certain ways, kind of. Look, my dudes, the things that we're going to start to wrap up the video. Look, we could go on with this stuff. I just talked about time travel for Remake for 16 minutes. We're creeping up on a 20-minute video that I talked about time travel for this game. Like, you can't write any one theory off. I can argue and talk about any goddamn thing and make it make sense, man. There's evidence to support it all. Now, does that mean that time travel is actually happening when it comes to Remake? Not at all. I don't even know if I truly believe that. I can talk about it for 20 minutes and I can look up all kinds of evidence and break it down scientifically for you. That doesn't mean that I necessarily believe it. But I'm not just here to give you my own, like, thoughts or opinions or my bias when it comes to this game. I'm here to talk about every angle and aspect that we can before we actually get Rebirth, right? We still got a little over a year or so until the game comes out, barring any delays. And I want to talk about every little thing that we can about this game for that big reveal once we finally understand what is actually going on with this story. Also, really quick, I just want to throw this in because we used that clip of Donnie Darko at the beginning. That was more just for the meme of it, but there's actually aspects of that movie that can make sense and work when it comes to Remake because that movie involves time travel as well. With the last video, we talked about going forward with Rebirth and beyond, there being, like, a lot of changes, and maybe by the end of the Remake trilogy story, there's a lot of changes that kind of culminate in Sephiroth being successful in his plans, but maybe our group realizes that, hey, we got to change it back to the original timeline. Zack's got to die, Aerith's got to die, maybe Jesse Biggs Wedge, maybe, like, Cloud's mom's alive, but she's got to die too. We kind of got to reset the timeline, so to speak. It's actually what happens in Donnie Darko. Like, by the end of that movie, he has to die to kind of save the universe. So again, also kind of like resetting the timeline. There's kind of a happy accident just kind of coming off the back of our last video, but I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. Also, that movie deals with, like, predetermined fate and shit, which is a lot of what Remake's about up until the end, of course. So again, there's some time travel aspects that are in some movies and things out there that are also in Remake. So who knows, man? But my dudes, that is going to be officially where we're ending the video. This is one of the longest videos I made in maybe ever on my channel. We've been here for quite a while. I think I lost my voice probably about 3, 4, 5 hours ago or some shit. I don't know, but we've been getting through it. My dudes, that's the video. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, give a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new today. More Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me to -YT. I'm going to Discord. Links for in the description. In the outro. Later, guys.
Have you ever seen a portal?
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain, or leave it like Cobain.